He pulled her suitcase out of the trunk without looking at her. Once the rain was coming in sideways under the airport canopy, and Grant Holloway just set that bag down on the wet concrete, like it was luggage he'd decided not to take on a trip, like she was luggage he'd decided not to take. Then his phone rang and his whole face changed, soft, warm, the face Savannah used to know. He turned his back to her and said, "I'm coming, I'm on my way," and drove away. If you've ever loved someone who made you feel invisible, this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel, follow Savannah's story all the way to the end, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning had started the way Savannah always started things she cared about, quietly, and with tremendous attention to detail. She had been awake since 5. Not because she couldn't sleep, but because she wanted to be the kind of wife who showed up fully, who didn't have to do the things that mattered. She had laid out Grant's travel clothes the night before, pressed and folded, because she knew how he got flustered when he was packing under pressure. And she had long ago stopped pointing that out and simply started solving it instead. She had made his coffee the way he liked it, 2 sugars, a splash of oat milk, heated exactly to the temperature where it didn't burn his tongue, and she had left it in the on the calamper without making a production of it. 4 years of marriage had taught Savannah Brooks that love is mostly architecture. It's in what you build quietly and maintain carefully, even when no one is admiring the work. She had planned this Hawaii trip for 3 months. 3 months of looking at Grant across dinner tables where he checked his phone more than he met her eyes. 3 months of watching him leave early and come home late and fall asleep on the couch in front of the television, without once asking how her day had gone. 3 months of lying beside him in a king-size bed somehow felt like a hallway, like a space people passed through rather than rested in. She had watched her marriage drift the way a boat drifts when nobody's holding the rope. Slowly, quietly, and then one morning you look up and the shore is so far away, you're not sure you can swim back. Hawaii was the rope. She had told herself that. 1 week. Sun and ocean and no conference calls, just the 2 of them, the way they used to be in the beginning when Grant would reach across restaurant tables and hold her hand for no reason. She had not told him what the trip cost. She had not told him about the suite she had reserved, the one with the private lanai that looked out over the water. She had not told him that she had contacted the resort's concierge and arranged for their first dinner to be on the beach, with candles and the specific wine they had drunk on their first date. She had done all of that because she still believed, after everything, that if she could just get Grant somewhere quiet, somewhere away from the ambition and the noise and the constant performance of building Holloway urban development into something his father would finally respect, she could find him again. She could find the man who had once told her she was the only person who made him feel like enough. The drive to Dallas-Fort Worth International had been fine, normal. Grant had spent most of it on a hands-free call with his project manager about a zoning permit in Phoenix, and Savannah had watched the city blur past the window and told herself that was okay. That was just work, that the trip hadn't started yet. She had checked them in at the curb. She had handled both bags. Grant had stayed on the call, gesturing an apology with his free hand, and she had smiled and waved it off because she had learned somewhere in the last 4 years that demanding his full attention felt like demanding charity. They were through security. They had found their gate. Savannah had bought them both water and a magazine she had no intention of reading, and was sitting beside him in the boarding area, close enough to touch when his phone rang. She noticed the way his jaw tightened before he even looked at the screen. She noticed the way he looked at the screen and then looked away from her. "I have to take this." He stood and walked maybe 15 feet away. Just enough distance. Savannah watched him. She had spent 4 years becoming excellent at watching Grant from a careful distance, reading the signals he didn't know he was sending. The way his shoulders dropped when it was a call he didn't want. The way his hand went to the back of his neck when he was lying. The way his voice changed, went lower and softer when he was talking to someone he was trying to impress. His voice went lower and softer. He was turned slightly away from her, but she could hear fragments. She wasn't straining. She wasn't trying. The words just arrived, of course. "No, I understand. Hey. Slow down." His hand was not at the back of his neck. His hand was on his chest, like the call had reached in and grabbed something there. "I'm coming, yes, I promise. I'm on my way right now." Savannah went completely still. Grant turned around. His face had rearranged itself into something she barely recognized, something urgent and alive in a way it hadn't been in months. He walked back toward her with his phone still in his hand, and he said, "I have to go." She stared at him. "What? It's Vanessa." She's had some kind of attack, a panic attack. She said there was some news he was already reaching for his carry-on. She needs someone there, Grant. Savannah's voice was steady. She was proud of how steady it was. Our flight board's in 40 minutes. I know that. I'll try to rebook for tomorrow. Or we can do it next weekend. There'll be another. Next, she said it flat. Not a question. Savannah, she's in crisis. What do you want me to do? I want you to sit down. She kept her voice very quiet. I want you to call her back and tell her you are on vacation with your wife. I want you to tell her that you hope she's all right and that she should call someone who is available to help her because you are not available right now. Grant looked at her like she had asked him to speak a foreign language. She doesn't have anyone else. She has a phone. Grant, she has every contact in your professional network. That's not fair. No. Something shifted behind Savannah's eyes. Something very quiet. No, it really isn't. She watched him process that. She watched him decide that she meant it wasn't fair of her to suggest those things, when in fact she meant something entirely different. Look, he said, and his voice dropped into the tone she recognized as his negotiating register, the one he used when he'd already made up his mind and needed the other person to feel like they'd been consulted. It's one flight we reschedule. It's not the end of the world. Vanessa is why does she call you, Grant? The question landed in the space between. He didn't answer immediately. That was its own answer. She's a consultant on the Phoenix project. We've been working closely and Why does she call your personal number at 7 in the evening and you answer before the second ring? Grant's jaw set. I'm not doing this here. I'm not doing this either. Savannah stood up. She was a tall woman, and when she stood up fully, she was nearly eye level with him. I'm telling you right now, Grant, if you walk out of this airport and go to her tonight, do not expect me to be where you left me when you get back. He looked at her, and something crossed his face that she would think about for a long time afterward, something almost like relief. Like a man who had been waiting for permission. Stop making everything about you, he said. She felt those words go through her the way cold water goes through you all at once. Everywhere, Grant Holloway picked up his carry-on bag. He walked back through security the wrong way, found an agent, explained something, and was escorted back out. Savannah stood at the gate and watched until he was out of sight. Then she sat down. Then she stood up again. Then she walked to the window and looked out at the tarmac, where a plane was being loaded in the early dark. She thought about the hotel reservation, the beach dinner, the wine. She thought about the morning 4 years ago when Grant had proposed to her in the parking lot of a Tex-Mex restaurant because he'd had the ring for 3 days and couldn't wait for the fancy dinner he'd planned. He'd been so nervous his hands were shaking. He'd said, I know this isn't the right place, but I can't spend another day without asking you. She thought about the way her mother had held her face in her hands and said, He sees you, sweetheart. That's the rarest thing in the world. Then she picked up her bag and walked outside to wait for the rideshare she had already called. The rain hit her the moment she stepped through the doors. Hard, diagonal sheets of it that soaked through her jacket in seconds. She could have waited inside. She chose not to. She stood there and let the rain come, and she felt something in her chest that was not quite grief, and not quite anger, and not quite relief. Something older than all of those. Something that had been building for a long time. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen, not Grant. The name said Caleb Mercer. She stared at it for a long moment. The rain ran down her face. She hadn't spoken to Caleb in almost 8 months. They stayed in contact out of necessity. There were documents, quarterly reviews, decisions that required her signature, but she had kept those interactions deliberately minimal. Formal, like managing a previous life from a safe distance. Caleb Mercer was 61 years old, white-haired, and had the particular patience of a man who had spent decades managing enormous wealth on behalf of a woman who wanted nothing to do with it. He had never once pressured her. He had never once suggested that she was wasting herself. He had simply kept everything running and waited, she answered. Caleb Savannah. His voice was the same as it always was measured, warm in a contained way like a fireplace in a large room. I was just checking in. You have that anniversary trip this week. I believe I'm at the airport. A pause. The flight to Honolulu. Another pause. Longer this time. Caleb had known Savannah since she was 19 years old, inheriting an empire she didn't want from a father she was still learning to grieve. He had watched her build a life designed to be invisible. He knew how to read her silences. Are you all right? Savannah looked at the rain. A cab pulled up to the curb and Emily 3 with kids and too much luggage tumbled out. Laughing about something, a little girl in a yellow raincoat spinning in the downpour like it was a gift. Mr. Mercer, Savannah said, activate my Whitmore credentials. "I'm coming home." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then Caleb said, "I'll have the jet ready in 90 minutes. She did not call Grant. She thought about it, the way you think about bad habits. You're in the process of breaking with recognition, but without action. She bought a dry shirt from one of the airport shops and changed in the bathroom. She found a quiet corner of the terminal, ordered a coffee she didn't particularly want, and sat with both hands wrapped around the cup while the enormity of what she had just set in motion settled over her. When Savannah Brooks, formerly Savannah Whitmore, had walked into Grant Holloway's orbit 4 years ago, she had been deliberate about everything. The modest apartment. The freelance work she kept small but genuine. The way she never corrected anyone who assumed she was financially dependent on her husband's success. It had not been deception for its own sake. It had been an experiment in the most essential question she had never been able to answer. Who am I to someone who doesn't know what I own? Growing up as Richard Whitmore's only daughter, Savannah had understood from a very early age that her relationships were contaminated by her inheritance before they even began. Friends who were interested in access, boyfriends who treated her like an asset to be managed, colleagues who were careful and deferential in ways that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the family name. Even her father, who had loved her as genuinely as a man built entirely of ambition could love anyone, had looked at her sometimes like she was infrastructure. Like she was something to be protected and leveraged. She had wanted one thing in her life that was entirely clean. One relationship where she could be certain that what she received, she had earned as a person. She had met Grant at a charity gala she had attended as a nobody, no Whitmore name. No family trust introduction, just Savannah Brooks in a second-hand gown that she had altered herself because she knew how to alter things. Grant had spilled wine on her and then spent 20 minutes being so genuinely horrified about it that she had laughed until her sides hurt. He had asked for her number in the most awkward way imaginable, and when she had given it to him, he had actually pumped his fist like a kid winning a carnival game. It had been real, she was certain of that. The early part had been entirely real. She just hadn't known that real things could still spoil. The private terminal was on the other side of the airport. Caleb had sent a car that met her at a side entrance, and Savannah walked through a series of quiet corridors that felt nothing like the public terminal. No crowds, no PA announcements, no families with too much luggage and not enough hands. Just clean, neutral space and a woman in a dark suit said, "Ms. Whitmore, everything is prepared," in the same tone one might use to describe a table reservation. Savannah had not heard that name said out loud to her, said to her face, by someone who meant it, in 4 years. Something happened when she heard it. Nothing dramatic. She didn't cry. She didn't feel a rush of power or arrival. She felt, more than anything, like a person who had been holding her breath for so long she had forgotten she was doing it, and had finally quietly exhaled. The jet was a Gulfstream. Small, clean, and carrying exactly the kind of discreet luxury that does not announce itself. She recognized it. She had grown up in planes like this. She had spent the last 4 years pretending that part of her life had belonged to someone else. She buckled herself in. She looked out the window at the dark runway. The rain was still falling. Somewhere across the city, Grant Holloway was walking into whatever apartment hotel room Vanessa Cole was in, with his voice soft and his chest open, being present for a woman who was not his wife. Savannah thought about calling him one more time. Considered it the way you consider a door. You've already decided to close, not because you want to open it, but because you want to be sure about the decision. She put her phone in her bag instead. The jet lifted off at 9:47 p.m. Caleb Mercer was waiting at the private terminal in Denver when she landed. He was standing outside the building in the cold morning air in a gray overcoat, and when he saw her walk down the air stairs, he walked forward to meet her. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at her, the way people look at something they've been waiting a long time to see again. "You look tired," he said finally. "I am tired. And the marriage?" She looked at him steadily. "The divorce papers are going to need to be filed in Texas. I'll need you to find me someone good." Caleb nodded. He had always been good at receiving information without making it harder to deliver. "I'll handle it today," he said. She walked with him toward the building. A team of people inside straightened when she entered, not because they had been told to, but because she carried herself in a way that invited it. Even in jeans and a damp jacket and no makeup, she had always had that. Her mother had said it was posture. Her father had said it was breeding. Savannah privately believed it was something simpler. She had never, not once in her life, apologized for taking up space. Grant's family had spent years trying to cure her of that. They had not succeeded. "Tell me where we are," she said to Caleb. following him down a corridor toward a conference room where she could already see senior faces. Whitmore Meridian is in excellent condition. The Phoenix Consortium deal is nearly finalized. There are some decisions about the Denver Community Development Initiative that have been waiting for your direct guidance rather than trustee proxy. He paused. And there are 17 things that have been piling up for 4 years because certain decisions require a Whitmore. Then let's deal with the 17 things. Savannah. He stopped walking. She stopped too. Are you sure you're ready for this? She thought about a suitcase being set down on wet concrete. She thought about the sound of a car driving away. She thought about a ring beside divorce papers on a silent table in a dark house, and the way a woman's voice sounds when she has finally stopped asking someone else to recognize her worth. I've been ready for 4 years, she said. I just got distracted. Back in Dallas, 6 days passed. Grant came home on the 3rd day. The house was exactly as Savannah had always kept it clean. Warm, everything in its place. He noticed nothing wrong for a full hour. He made himself dinner. He watched the news. He texted Savannah twice, and when she didn't answer, he assumed she was angry and that she would get over it, because she always got over it. He slept in his own bed and reached for her in the dark out of habit, and when his hand found empty space, he pulled it back and told himself she was probably at her sister's. On the 4th day, he noticed the closet. Her side was empty. Not dramatically, not stripped. She had been careful and methodical about it, because she was careful and methodical about everything. But there was nothing of hers left, the dresses she wore to his company dinners. The specific blue sweater he had once told her looked beautiful on her. The organized rows of shoes, the small jewelry tray on the dresser. He stood in front of her empty side of the closet for a long time. Then he called her. The number had been disconnected. He called again as if perhaps he had dialed wrong. Disconnected. He sat on the edge of the bed. He sat there for a while without moving. Then he pulled himself together the way ambitious men pull themselves together by converting a feeling into a task. He called Miles Carter, his new assistant, and he said, I need you to find my wife. She's not answering her phone. She may have changed her number. Check hotels, check her sister's place. Check, just find her. Miles was 24 and efficient and slightly terrified of Grant, in the way junior employees are terrified of forceful men who move quickly. He said yes, sir, right away, and spent the next 40 minutes making calls. Grant went downstairs and found the wedding ring on the kitchen counter. Beside it was an envelope. Inside the envelope were divorce papers, already signed by Savannah. Clean, professional. Handled by an attorney whose firm name he didn't recognize. Also in the envelope was a check. He looked at the amount. He looked at it for a full minute, calculating. It was the precise sum of every dollar he had deposited into the household account over their entire marriage, every contribution to shared expenses, utilities, groceries, the joint account he had always privately considered the household running on his income. She had given it all back. He was still standing in the kitchen holding the check when Miles appeared in the doorway. Miles was pale. Grant had never seen Miles pale before. Sir, Miles said carefully, I found her good. Where is she? What hotel? She's not in a hotel. Miles came forward and set a printed document on the kitchen counter beside the ring and the check. There's something I think you need to look at this yourself. Grant picked up the papers. At the top of the first page, in the clean standard format of a financial intelligence profile, Savannah Whitmore Brooks. He read the name twice, looked at Miles. Whitmore? Miles said nothing. Grant looked back down at the page. He began to read, and the kitchen became very quiet, and the only sound was the paper in his hands and somewhere outside a car passing on the wet street. The name Whitmore. He knew that name. He knew it the way anyone in American commercial development knew it, with a kind of reflexive respect that existed at the cellular level, the way certain names simply mean money so vast and so established that they operate more like geography than biography. Richard Whitmore, the infrastructure empire, the hotels, the logistics networks, the energy holdings. A name on buildings and roads and financial disclosures that shaped the landscape of this country's commercial development. Grant's eyes moved down the page. Savannah Whitmore Brooks, sole heir to the Whitmore family estate. Controlling interest in Whitmore Meridian Holdings through a private family trust. Estimated personal net worth. He stopped reading. He read the number again, $3.8 billion. His wife. The woman his mother called sweet but limited. The woman he had watched endure an entire dinner where the wife of his CFO had made 4 separate jokes about her weight, and he had not once intervened because the dinner had gone well and it wasn't worth the disruption. The woman he had set down on a wet curb outside an airport terminal, because another woman had called and he had gone, because somewhere deep in the architecture of his assumptions, he had believed that Savannah would be there when he got back. She would always be there, she always had been. Grant sat down slowly on one of the kitchen stools. Miles was watching him very carefully. The Phoenix Project, Grant said. His voice sounded strange to him, distant, the consortium deal. The $620 million financing package. Miles swallowed. Yes, sir. Who is the major private stakeholder in that consortium? Miles was quiet. Oskelly once. Whitmore Meridian Holdings, sir. Grant put his hands flat on the counter. The woman he had called a gold digger in a whispered fight 2 years ago, when she had simply asked him to be home for dinner on her birthday. The woman he had abandoned beside a suitcase in the rain. The woman he had told to stop making everything about herself. That woman controlled the deal that his company's entire future depended on. Grant Holloway stared at nothing for a very long time. Then he said quietly, to no one in particular, she never told me. And Miles, who was young and smart and knew when not to speak, said nothing at all. Outside, the Dallas afternoon continued without interruption. Traffic moved, the sun came out from behind clouds. Somewhere across the city, a private jet was lifting off from Love Field, because Grant didn't know yet that Savannah hadn't gone to Denver for the first time. She had gone back, she had simply come home. There is a particular kind of silence that exists in a house that a person has recently left, not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of a room that remembers having someone in it. Grant felt that silence in every corner of their house that evening. He walked through it room by room, as if he might find something she had left behind besides the check and the ring and the papers. He found the hair tie on the bathroom shelf. He found the book on her nightstand, bookmarked 60 pages from the end. He found in the drawer of the kitchen desk where she kept her design sketches a photograph she had printed and placed there months ago, the two of them at a friend's wedding, before everything had gone sideways, Savannah laughing at something off camera, her whole face open and illuminated. He held the photograph for a long time. He had told himself the marriage was difficult because Savannah was sensitive. He had told himself she was needy, that she took things personally, that she didn't understand the pressure he was under. He had constructed, as people construct these things, a version of events in which his failures were her fragility, in which the coldness he had let grow between them was something she had caused by being too much, too emotional, too present, too invested in the small architecture of their daily life. Looking at the photograph, he tried to hold on to that version. It didn't hold, because the woman in the photograph was not fragile. She was laughing, she was taking up space without apology, and her eyes were bright, and he recognized it now. Standing in his kitchen alone, in a way he had somehow never permitted himself to recognize it, while she was actually there, she was extraordinary. He had known that once. Somewhere between the knowing and the now, he had buried it under something easier, something that cost less. He picked up his phone, he booked a flight to Denver. He told himself it was about the deal. He was a practical man. He needed to speak to the stakeholders. That was just business. He was still telling himself that when the wheels left the ground, but by the time the plane leveled off over the plains, he had run out of people to convince. Grant Holloway looked out the window at the dark below him and knew, with the particular clarity that arrives only when it's too late to be comfortable, that he wasn't flying to Denver for the deal. He was flying to Denver because he had set down the most valuable thing he had ever been given, on a wet curb in the dark and driven away, and he needed not to get it back. He was not naive enough in this moment of pure horrible clarity to think it was retrievable. He needed to look at what he had done. He needed to understand the full shape of his mistake. The plane flew on through the dark, carrying Grant Holloway west toward a woman who had already decided quietly, completely, and with the particular grace of someone who had stopped waiting for anyone's permission, that her life would now be lived on entirely different terms. She had given him 4 years. She had given him everything. She had not her money, but herself, her patience, her love, her willingness to stand in beautiful rooms and absorb the small cruelties of his world without once letting anyone see what she was actually carrying. Now she had given him one last thing. She had given him the truth. And the truth was, the woman Grant Holloway spent 4 years believing was lucky to have him had been, every single day, the most powerful person in the room. She had simply chosen not to make him feel it. That was the last kindness she had given him. And he had set it down on a curb in the rain. The jet landed in Denver just before sunrise, and Savannah Whitmore walked off that plane a different woman than the one who had boarded it. Not because anything about her had changed, but because she had stopped pretending that the version of herself she had been living for 4 years. This was the whole truth. Caleb Mercer was waiting at the bottom of the air stairs with a black umbrella he didn't need, because the Denver morning was clear and cold and still. He held it anyway, because Caleb was the kind of man who prepared for every possibility. And because in the 30 years he had worked for the Whitmore family, he had learned that the women in that family often arrived from difficult places needing something solid to walk toward. He looked at her face when she reached the bottom step. He said nothing about what he saw there. "The car is ready," he said. "I've taken the liberty of opening the Colorado house rather than the penthouse. I thought you might want something smaller." Savannah looked at him. "You always think of everything, Caleb. It's what you pay me for." A pause. Among other things, they drove through Denver in the early gray light, and Savannah watched the city from the back seat without speaking. She had lived here until she was 27. She knew these streets. She knew the way this city looked before it woke up. All clean angles and cold air and the mountains in the distance doing what mountains do, existing with total indifference to human drama. She found that comforting right now. The indifference of mountains. The Colorado house was her father's. Not a mansion Richard Whitmore had built, the family primary residence in Connecticut. And the Denver penthouse was for business, for proximity to Whitmore Meridian's headquarters. But this house, a 4-bedroom craftsman in a quiet neighborhood near Washington Park, had been where he came when he needed to think. He had bought it when Savannah was 11, and she had spent summers here, and it smelled like old wood and her father's specific brand of pipe tobacco, even though he had been gone for 9 years and no one had smoked in it since. She walked through the front door and stood in the hallway for a moment with her eyes closed. She let herself feel it, all of it. The grief she had been carrying since the airport, the anger she had been keeping very carefully contained because she knew what happened when she let it move through her unchecked. She felt the 4 years of small humiliations, the dinner party jokes, Grant's silence when his mother said things. The Hawaii trip she had planned for 3 months and the way he had looked at her when Vanessa called that look of relief, that look of a man who had found his exit. She felt all of it, standing in her dead father's house at 5:30 in the morning, alone for the first time in 4 years. Then she opened her eyes, walked to the kitchen, and put on a pot of coffee. She had work to do. Caleb arrived at 8 with 2 senior members of the Whitmore Meridian executive team, a woman named Patricia Ossie who ran the investment division, and a man named David Chung who had been overseeing the Phoenix Consortium deal. They sat at the kitchen table with their laptops and their careful professional expressions, and Savannah could feel them recalibrating in real time, adjusting their internal picture of who she was, reconciling the woman they had known through proxy signatures and quarterly calls, with the woman who was now sit across from them in jeans and no makeup, asking sharp questions about leverage ratios. Patricia was the first one to stop treating her like she might break. She slid a folder across the table and the consortium is fully structured. The Phoenix Horizon District deal is the last major piece. The primary private stakeholder on our side holds 31%, which gives us effective veto power over terms. And who is the borrower? David looked at his notes. Holloway Urban Development. They need the $620 million a package closed within 60 days, or they lose the Phoenix municipal contract. Without it, the company has significant liquidity problems. Savannah was quiet for a moment. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. Patricia and David waited. What are the terms as structured? Standard commercial rates. Nothing punitive. It's actually a favorable package. The deal's solid. The Phoenix project is legitimate, and Holloway's track record is acceptable. Then we proceed on merit, Savannah said. Patricia blinked. Proceed. If the deal meets our criteria, it moves forward. My personal situation doesn't enter into this. David cleared his throat carefully. Savannah, Ms. Whitmore, the borrower is your estranged husband. Yes, she met his eyes steadily, which is exactly why we proceed on merit. Because if I use this position to destroy his company, I become someone who uses financial power as a personal weapon. And that is not who I am. She set her mug down. Is the deal sound? Then it moves forward. Next item. Caleb, who had been sitting slightly apart from the others with his hands folded, allowed himself a small private smile that he directed at his own shoes. The meeting went on for 3 hours. By the end of it, Patricia Ossie had stopped looking at Savannah with careful, managed deference and had started looking at her the way she looked at people she respected. David Chung had stopped finishing his sentences with the particular upward lilt of a man, checking whether he was about to say something wrong. They had adjusted. They had seen her. It felt different from being seen by Grant. It felt cleaner. After they left, Caleb stayed. He refilled his coffee and sat back down and looked at her across the kitchen table with the patience of a man who had nowhere else to be. "You should eat something," he said. "I'm fine. You're not fine. You're functioning, which is different." He paused. "The divorce attorney is excellent. Her name is Renata Voss. She has your file. How fast can it move?" "Texas law requires a 60-day waiting period after filing. The paperwork is already filed as of this morning. You'll have your answer in 2 months." Savannah nodded. "Is there anything else you need from me today?" Caleb asked. She thought about that. Actually thought about it the way she hadn't permitted herself to think about what she needed in a very long time. "Tell me about the Denver Community Initiative," she said. "The Abandoned Properties Project. Where does it stand?" Caleb's expression shifted into something that was almost enthusiasm, which for Caleb was remarkable. "We have 14 properties identified. 3 are already in the acquisition phase. The concept converting commercial dead zones into affordable housing and vocational centers has been received extremely well by the city. But several key decisions have been waiting for direct Whitmore guidance. The trustees weren't comfortable making them without you. Schedule a site visit for tomorrow," Savannah said. "I want to see the properties myself. You want to go to the actual sites. Is that surprising?" "It is," Caleb said honestly, "given that your father's preferred method of inspecting properties was to look at photographs." Savannah almost smiled. "My father built things. I want to understand what I'm building." He wrote something in his notebook. Then he looked up at her. "Savannah, for what it's worth, and I know you'll tell me it isn't worth very much." He paused, choosing his words. "You were missed. Not the money. Not the decisions you." She looked at him for a long moment. "Caleb, yes, thank you." He nodded once and because he understood, as very few people in her life ever had, that she needed things acknowledged, not elaborated on. After he left, Savannah sat alone in her father's kitchen for a long time. She did not call her sister. She did not call any of the friends she had managed carefully through 4 years of kept secrets. She sat with the silence and let it be what it was. And somewhere around noon, she went upstairs to the room she had always used as a girl, lay down on the narrow bed under the old blue quilt her mother had made, and slept for 10 hours without dreaming. She needed to be whole for what was coming. She could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives. Grant Holloway was not the kind of man who received information quietly. He was not the kind of man who learned he had made a catastrophic mistake and sat with that knowledge gracefully. He was the kind of man who, upon discovering that the world was not arranged the way he believed, immediately got on a plane. She knew him. That was the hardest part. She knew him completely, and she still loved parts of him, and neither of those things changed what had to happen. She slept, and the Denver afternoon turned to evening, and the mountains turned purple and then black outside the window. And somewhere in Dallas, Grant Holloway was standing in a silent house, holding a check she had written, and a she had left behind, and beginning to understand that the most ordinary thing in his life had never been ordinary at all. Meanwhile, 600 miles away in Dallas, something else was happening. Vanessa Cole had called Grant 4 times since the airport night, and he had answered everyone. She was staying at the Ritz-Carlton downtown, and she had installed herself in his life with the practiced ease of a woman who had done this kind of thing before, who understood that a man in transition was a man who needed to feel needed, and that being needed at the right moment was its own form of leverage. She was beautiful in a way that required significant effort and announced itself immediately, which was the opposite of Savannah, who was beautiful in a way that accumulated quietly over time and ambushed you. Vanessa knew her own value and wielded it with precision. She had been Grant's girlfriend in his late 20s. Before he met Savannah, and the relationship had ended not because anything went wrong, but because Grant had been offered an opportunity in Dallas, and Vanessa had been offered an opportunity in New York, and neither of them had loved the other quite enough to rearrange their ambitions. They had stayed in professional contact, and then, 18 months ago, Grant had hired her consulting firm for the Phoenix Project, and Vanessa had arrived in Dallas and looked at Grant's life and done a quick, cold calculation. He was successful, he was unhappy. His wife was quiet and plus-size and seemed from the outside entirely unremarkable, and Grant had always responded to her. It had not been difficult. She had not manufactured the panic attack at the airport. Exactly, she had called him knowing it would cost something. And she had let it cost him, because she understood that a man who pays a price for you believes, afterward, that you must be worth it. Grant arrived at her hotel suite that night with flowers he had grabbed from a gas station, because he was not thinking clearly, and Vanessa had opened the door and looked at the gas station flowers and understood that she had him. She told him what he needed to hear, that she was frightened, that she had needed him, that no one else could have helped. Grant, who had not felt genuinely needed by the woman at home in longer than he could remember, absorbed this like water into dry ground. He stayed that night, and the next. On the third day, something uncomfortable started happening in the back of Grant's mind. A low-frequency signal he kept trying to override with work and Vanessa's presence and the forward momentum of the Phoenix deal. But it was there, the image of Savannah standing on the curb in the rain. Her voice, "If you leave me here tonight, don't expect me to still be waiting when you come back." He had told himself she was bluffing. He had told himself that 17 times by day 4. On day 5 he went home. The house was dark. He stood in the living room and called her name, which he hadn't done when they lived there. He had usually walked in and gone directly to his office or the kitchen, because the habit of greeting her had faded somewhere in the 3rd year, and he had not noticed its absence until right now, in the silence that followed the sound of her name. When nothing came back, he called her phone. Disconnected. He stood in the kitchen for a long time before he opened the refrigerator, found nothing she had cooked, made himself a sandwich, and ate it standing up. He was fine, she would call. She always called, she did not call. Day 6, he called her sister, Meredith, in Austin. Meredith, who had never particularly liked Grant, answered with the particular neutrality of a woman who knew something and had been told not to say it. "She's fine," Meredith said. "Where is she?" "She's fine." "Grant, Meredith, I need to—" "She's fine." A pause with weight in it. "You should have thought about all of this before the airport." The call ended. Grant stared at his phone. Day 7. He walked into their bedroom and opened her closet and stood there for a full minute looking at the empty hangers. He sat on the edge of the bed. He picked up the photograph from her nightstand, a woman laughing at something off camera, her face completely open, completely present, and he sat with it in his hands and felt the specific horror of a man who is beginning to understand what he has done. He called Miles Carter. He said, "I don't care how." "Find her," Miles called back 31 minutes later. His voice was strange, not nervous in his usual way, but something more fundamental than nervous. Something closer to awe. "Sir," Miles said, "I need you to come to the office. Just tell me where she is, sir. Please come to the office." Grant drove to Holloway Urban Development headquarters in 20 minutes. Miles met him at the elevator with a printed document in his hands and the expression of a man who was not sure how the next 5 minutes were going to go. He followed Grant into the office, closed the door, and set the document on the desk. Grant picked it up. He read the name at the top, Savannah Whitmore Brooks. He read it twice. He looked at Miles. He looked back at the document. The name Whitmore arrived in his brain the way certain names arrive, not as new information, but as something so large it had to be processed in pieces. Whitmore. Whitmore Meridian, Richard Whitmore. The infrastructure empire. The hotels, the energy holdings. The name on commercial buildings he had studied as a young developer, the way theology students study scripture. "This is wrong," Grant said. "This is a mistake." "It's not, sir." Miles's voice was very careful. "I verified it through 3 separate financial intelligence sources. The trust structure kept it private, that's why it didn't surface in any standard background. But the information is accurate." Grant turned to the second page. He read, he turned to the third. His hands were completely still on the paper, which cost him something because his hands wanted very much to shake. $3.8 billion, Miles. His voice was almost conversational, which meant he was far past conversational. "The Phoenix Consortium deal." Miles closed his eyes briefly. "Yes, sir, the largest private stakeholder, Whitmore Meridian Holdings." Miles opened his eyes. "Miss Whitmore, your wife, her company, holds 31% of the financing consortium. Effective veto authority over the entire deal." Grant set the papers down on his desk very slowly and deliberately, the way a person sets something down when they are afraid that if they're not careful, they'll throw it through a window. He had stood in the airport and told his wife to stop making everything about herself. He had set her suitcase on a wet curb and driven away to another woman. He had let 4 years of his mother's whispered jokes and his colleagues' assumptions and his own casual, catastrophic inattention accumulate into an airport curb and a phone call with a voice that had gone soft for someone who was not her. The woman he had done all of that to control the deal that his entire company's future depended on. Grant sat down. He stayed very still for a long time. Miles stood near the door and said nothing, which was the most useful thing he had ever done in his employment. Finally, Grant said, "Get me a flight to Denver tonight?" Now Miles pulled out his phone. Then he hesitated. "Sir, what are you going to say to her?" Grant looked at him. It was the most honest thing Miles had ever asked him, and they both knew it wasn't really about logistics. "I don't know yet," Grant said. Miles nodded and started booking the flight. Grant sat at his desk and looked at the photograph he had brought from home, her face open, her eyes bright, that laugh that came from somewhere real and understood, for the first time with full clarity, that he had spent 4 years living beside something extraordinary and had chosen, every single day, not to look directly at it, not because he couldn't, but because looking directly at something extraordinary demands something from you. It demands that you be worthy of it. And somewhere in the second year of their marriage, Grant Holloway had made the quiet, devastating decision that he would rather feel like the impressive one than do the work of being worthy. He had married a woman who controlled billions and never spent a day making him feel less than. He had married a woman who absorbed cruelty at his company dinners with grace he had mistaken for passivity. He had married a woman who had planned a 3-month anniversary trip to save something he had been quietly dismantling for years, and he had thrown her suitcase onto a wet curb and told her to stop making everything about herself. Now he was getting on a plane to Denver with no prepared speech and no strategy, and none of the armor he usually wore into difficult rooms. Just the photograph and the financial profile and the specific, irreversible knowledge of his own failure. The flight boarded at 9 p.m. Grant sat in first class and didn't drink and didn't sleep and didn't open his laptop. He looked out the window at the darkness below and thought about the version of this story he was going to have to tell himself, not the version where he was the successful man who made a mistake, but the version where the mistake revealed something about who he actually was when he was not being watched. He was not sure he liked that man. But at 37,000 feet, somewhere over the flat dark of the Texas Panhandle, Grant Holloway made a decision not to get her back. He was not that delusional, not to fix it. Some things could not be fixed, only understood. He decided to stop lying about what had happened. Not to Savannah, to himself. He had believed somewhere beneath every conscious thought that Savannah stayed because she had nowhere else to go. Because she was plus size and quiet and financially dependent, and the world was not always generous to women who fit that description. He had believed it without ever saying it, without ever letting it surface into language, because if it surfaced into language, he would have had to look at it, and looking at it would have meant confronting what it said about him. But the financial profile on his desk had stripped that comfortable lie completely bare. She had somewhere to go. She had always had somewhere to go. She had $3.8 billion worth of somewhere to go. And she had chosen to stay in a house with him, in a marriage with him, loving him with the full knowledge of everything she was choosing not to use. She had not stayed because she had no options. She had stayed because she wanted him. The plane began its descent into Denver. The city spread below him in the dark. All those lights, and somewhere down there in a house near Washington Park, the woman he had failed was sleeping or working, or standing in her father's kitchen holding a coffee mug with both hands was the way she always did, and she was not waiting for him. That was the hardest part. Not the money, not the professional humiliation of the deal, not even his mother's voice in his head, already rewriting history in the way she rewrote every history that reflected poorly on her son. The hardest part was knowing that the woman who had always been there, patient, constant, anchoring the whole architecture of his daily life, was no longer oriented toward him. She had turned toward something else, herself, it turned out. And from what the financial profile suggested, and from what Miles had found in the initial research about Whitmore Meridian's recent activity, a community development initiative, board meetings, site visits, she was not doing it tentatively. She was not easing back into an old life like someone testing cold water. She had walked back into Whitmore Meridian like a woman who had always belonged there and had simply been elsewhere for a while. Grant had assumed she would fall apart without the structure of their marriage. She had not fallen apart. She had expanded. The wheels touched down and Grant gathered his bag and walked through the Denver airport in the early hours of the morning, and not one person who passed him knew that the man in the expensive suit and the hollow eyes was walking toward the most important confrontation of his life. Not a confrontation with a billionaire, a confrontation with himself, because Savannah Whitmore had already done the hardest thing she had decided, on a wet curb at an airport, that she would no longer make herself smaller to fit inside someone else's idea of who she should be. And Grant, arriving in Denver with his gas station flowers already wilted in a hotel trash can 6 miles away, was only just beginning to understand what that decision was going to cost him. Not in money. Not in the deal, not in any currency that his company's balance sheet could measure. In something older and more irretrievable than all of that. He had lost the only person who had ever loved him before he became anything. And he had no one to blame for that loss but the man he saw every morning in the mirror, who had looked at extraordinary and chosen every day To treat it as ordinary, the airport doors opened and the Denver cold hit him full in the face. Grant Holloway walked out into it, and somewhere across the sleeping city, Savannah Whitmore turned over in her childhood bed, pulled the blue quilt her mother had made closer around her shoulders, and slept the deep and dreamless sleep of a woman who had finally, after years of waiting, stopped apologizing for what she was worth. Grant had not slept on the plane. He had not slept in the car from the airport either, though the driver had been discreet enough not to attempt conversation. He arrived at the Ritz-Carlton Denver at 2 a.m, checked in, sat on the edge of the hotel bed in his clothes, and stared at the wall until 4. Then he got up, showered, put on fresh clothes from his overnight bag, and went downstairs to find coffee. He had one goal this morning. One, find Savannah before she found out he was in Denver. Because if she found out he was here before he reached her, she would have time to build walls, and Savannah had always been exceptional at building walls that looked like open doors. He called Miles from the hotel lobby. I need to know where she is. Not the house where she is right now this morning. What is she doing? Miles, who had apparently also not slept, said she has a site visit this morning. One of the Whitmore Meridian properties, an abandoned commercial block near 5 Points. The visit was scheduled for 9 a.m. according to the public calendar the community initiative posted online. Grant checked his watch. 6:47. Send me the address. He was in a car by 7:15. He arrived at the 5 Points property at 8:50 and stood across the street with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched. A group of maybe 15 people was already assembled near the building entrance, engineers in hard hats, a few people in business clothes, several individuals who looked like community representatives, a woman with a city planning badge on a lanyard. They were talking amongst themselves, reviewing documents, pointing at the building's exterior with the focused energy of people who were genuinely solving something. And then Savannah arrived. She came on foot, which was the first thing that surprised him. No car, no assistant, no entrance. She walked up from half a block away in jeans and work boots and a simple cream-colored blouse, her chestnut hair pulled back, carrying a leather portfolio under one arm. She was talking on her phone as she walked, and even from across the street, Grant could see the shift that moved through the assembled group the moment they spotted her. People straightened, not performatively, genuinely. The way people straighten when someone walks in whose attention they actually want. She ended her call, greeted 2 of the engineers by name, shook hands with the city planning woman, and within 60 seconds had the entire group reorganized and moving toward the building entrance with a clarity of direction that Grant recognized immediately because it was the same quality he had always prized in himself. Leadership. Actual leadership, not the performance of it, but the substance. He stood on the sidewalk across the street and felt something move through him that was not quite guilt and not quite awe, but contained elements of both. He had sat across dinner tables from this woman for 4 years and talked about his own projects in the exhaustive detail of a man who assumed his audience had nothing more interesting to contribute. He had described zoning challenges and financing structures and community impact assessments, while she sat across from him and listened with her chin in her hand, and he had understood that listening as devotion. It had been professional patience. She had simply been too kind to correct him. Across the street. He walked toward the building entrance. A young man with a clipboard near the door stepped forward and said, "Sir, this is a private site visit. Are you on the Grant Holloway?" He stopped. "I'm here to see Ms. Whitmore." The young man looked at his clipboard, looked back at Grant. "I don't have you on the list." "No," Grant said. "You wouldn't." From inside, Savannah's voice carried clearly. She was asking someone a question about load-bearing walls. The engineer answered. She asked a follow-up that made the engineer pause before responding, which meant she already knew the answer and was testing whether he did. "Sir," the young man said carefully, "I'm going to need to. It's all right. Daniel." Caleb Mercer appeared in the doorway. He looked at Grant with the expression of a man who had been expecting this visit and had opinions about it that he was professionally obligated not to express. "Mr. Holloway," Caleb said. Grant met his eyes as, "I need to speak with her. I'm aware of why you're here." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "She's in the middle of a working site visit with city planners and community representatives. If you walk in there right now, you make this about yourself instead of about them." Grant felt that land. He felt it because it was exactly the kind of thing Savannah would have said to him, patient, direct, not unkind, and hearing it from Caleb in Savannah's absence was its own form of instruction. "Then I'll wait," Grant said. Caleb looked at him for a long moment, recalibrating. "There's a coffee shop 2 blocks east," he said finally. "I'll tell her you're here." Grant went to the coffee shop. He ordered coffee he didn't taste and sat at a table by the window and waited. 40 minutes passed. He watched the street. He checked his phone twice and put it face down both times because there was nothing on it he wanted to see. At 9:48, Savannah walked in. She was still carrying the leather portfolio. She spotted him immediately. The coffee shop was small, and he was the only person sitting alone in a suit, and her expression did not change. That was the thing about Savannah. Her face had always been readable to him, but only what she wanted readable. The rest she kept somewhere behind her eyes, in a place he had never been given full access to. She walked to his table and stood across from him. She did not sit down immediately. "Caleb said you were here," she said. "I know I should have called. You couldn't. I changed my number." She looked at him, the way she had always looked at him, when she was deciding how much of herself to bring to a conversation. Then she pulled out the chair and sat down. "You have 10 minutes?" "Grant, I have another meeting, 10 minutes. He had flown from Dallas at midnight for 10 minutes. "Okay," he said. "Okay, that's fair." He looked at her across the small table and felt, for the first time in longer than he could name, absolutely no idea what to say. He had prepared things on the plane, versions of sentences, explanations. He had even, somewhere over Colorado, constructed what he considered an honest accounting of his failures. All of it had evaporated the moment she sat down across from him and looked at him with those hazel eyes that had always seen more of him than he was comfortable with. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. Not an accusation. It came out almost like a confession. Savannah did not look surprised by the question. "Because I needed to know who you would be if you thought I had nothing." The sentence hit him the same way the financial profile had hit him in waves, each wave revealing something the previous one had obscured. "That's not. You tested me." Her voice was firm but not angry. Anger would have been easier. "I didn't set traps for you. Grant, I didn't invent scenarios to catch you failing. I just lived my life alongside yours and let you be exactly who you chose to be. Everything you showed me freely. But you had information I didn't have, so did you." She leaned forward slightly. "You had 4 years of information. You knew I planned our anniversaries. You knew I learned the names of every person who worked for you because you mentioned them once in passing. You knew I never once asked you for anything that cost money. You knew I sat at your company dinners and smiled while your mother made jokes I was not supposed to hear." Her voice stayed level, completely level, which was somehow worse than if it had broken. "You had all the information you needed, Grant. You just didn't think it required a response." He had no answer to that. He had prepared many things on the plane, and not one of them was adequate to that. "I'm not here to get you back," he said finally. "I know that." He stopped again. "I just needed to look at you and tell you that I know what I did." Something shifted in her face. Barely perceptible, but he knew her few do. "Grant," she asked quietly. "Say it." He looked at her. This was the part he had not prepared on the plane, because preparing it would have meant saying it in his own head first, and he had not been ready to say it in his own head. "I made you feel ordinary," he said deliberately. "Because ordinary felt safe to me. Because if you were ordinary, I didn't have to be afraid of losing you. And if I didn't have to be afraid of losing you..." He stopped. His jaw worked for a moment. "I didn't have to try." The silence that followed was the longest 10 seconds of his adult life. Savannah looked at him steadily. Then she said, "That might be the most honest thing you've ever said to me. I know it's 4 years too late. I know that too." She looked down at her portfolio. She looked back up, and Grant saw it just for a second, just a flash of the woman behind the composure, the genuine grief. Because she had loved him. He had never doubted that. And knowing that made it worse, not better. It would have been easier if she had stopped loving him gradually and quietly, the way a fire burns down without anyone noticing. But that was not what had happened. She had loved him all the way up to an airport curb in the rain. And then she had made a decision. "The Phoenix deal," she said, shifting back to solid ground, back to the territory where things could be managed. "I want you to know it moves forward on merit. My team reviewed it. The deal is sound. Your company gets a fair process." Grant blinked. "Savannah, I didn't come here about the deal. I know why you came. I'm telling you about the deal anyway, because in 2 weeks you're going to have lawyers and advisors telling you that your estranged wife holds veto power over your financing, and I want you to hear it from me first. It will not be used against you." Her eyes were direct, unflinching. "I am not interested in destroying something that 200 people depend on because my marriage failed. That's not who I am." Grant stared at her. He had come here imagining many versions of this conversation: anger, tears, cold dismissal, even a door slammed in his face. He had not imagined this. He had not imagined sitting across from his wife while she told him, with complete composure, that she was going to protect his company's future even after what he had done. "Why?" he said. "Why would you do that?" "Because it's right," she said simply. "And because I'm not going to let what you did turn me into someone who uses power the way you used to use silence." As a weapon, she stood up. "Your 10 minutes are up." Stood. He wanted to say something that would hold the moment longer. He could feel it closing around him, this chance, this window. "Savannah," she stopped. Looked at him. "I'm sorry. Not for the deal, not for—" He pressed his hand flat against the table. "I'm sorry that I looked at you every day and chose not to see you. That's the thing I can't fix, I know that, but I needed you to know I can see it now." She held his gaze for 3 seconds. 4, 5. "Goodbye, Grant," she said. She walked out. He watched her through the coffee shop window until she turned the corner and disappeared. And then he sat back down and put his head in his hands and sat there for a long time, while the coffee shop moved around him with total indifference. He had expected her to be destroyed. Some quiet, shameful part of him had been counting on it, had needed her to be broken so that his own failure would feel less catastrophic by comparison. People do this, they need the thing they damaged to show the damage, so they can believe the damage is real and therefore finished, rather than ongoing. But Savannah was not broken. Savannah was building a community development initiative in the 5 Points neighborhood of Denver, asking load-bearing questions that stumped engineers, moving through her reclaimed life with the particular momentum of a woman who had been waiting 4 years to take up her full space. Grant drove back to his hotel. He called his attorney. He said, "The divorce papers are valid. Don't contest anything." His attorney, who had been preparing a very different kind of call, was silent for a long moment before saying, "Are you sure?" Grant said. "Don't contest anything." He booked a flight home for that afternoon. He did not call Vanessa. He sat in the hotel room and thought about something Savannah had said, not the words themselves, but the way she had said them. With her hands flat on the table, and her back straight and her voice at the exact same temperature the entire time, like someone who had already moved through the fire and come out the other side and was now simply describing what it had been like. She had not needed him to validate her pain. She had not needed him to agree that the airport had been devastating, or that 4 years of small humiliations had accumulated into something unforgivable. She knew what it was. She didn't need his corroboration. That was new, that specific quality of self-possession. He had not seen it in her before. Or maybe he had and had never let himself look directly at it. Because if he had looked directly at it, he would have known. He would have understood years ago that it was not his intention of sensor way of flower to set the gavant circens. She was simply pointing herself elsewhere for the moment, with the patience of someone who has other sources of light. He had mistaken her patience for dependency. That mistake had cost him everything. Meanwhile, Savannah returned to the site visit, walked back into the circle of engineers and planners without a word about where she had been, and picked up exactly where she had left off. She asked the city planner about infrastructure timelines. She discussed the vocational center layout with an architect who was clearly pleased to be taken seriously. She crouched down in her work boots and looked at a foundation issue a contractor was explaining and asked 3 questions that the contractor answered with increasing animation. Patricia Ossie, who had come late to the site visit and arrived just in time to watch Grant disappear around a corner with the defeated posture of a man whose plan had not worked, fell into step beside Caleb at the edge of the group. "Grant Holloway," she said quietly. "He flew from Dallas last night," Caleb said. "How did it go?" Caleb watched Savannah across the room, crouched beside a contractor, absolutely focused. "Exactly as it should have," he said. Patricia was quiet for a moment. "She's extraordinary. You know, I've worked with a lot of principals." "She's something different, I know," Caleb said. "She always was." That evening, Savannah sat at her father's kitchen table with a bowl of soup she had made herself and the project files spread around her, and she let the day settle. She thought about Grant's face across the coffee shop table. She thought about the sentence he had said, "I looked at you every day and chose not to see you," and she let herself feel the full weight of it because she was not in the business of denying what things cost her. It had cost her something. Hearing him say it had cost her something specific and located not in her chest but somewhere deeper, someplace where the 4 years lived, she let herself feel it. And then she put the feeling somewhere real and finite and not consuming, the way you put something in a drawer that you're not ready to throw away, but that you also don't need on your table. She went back to the project files. She had 12 properties to redesign from the inside out. She had an entrepreneurship fund to structure for women who were rebuilding from exactly the kind of starting point she recognized. She had a company that had been waiting for her to come home and lead it, rather than manage it from a careful, guilty distance. She had work to do, real work. Work that mattered. She did not know yet that Vanessa Cole had landed in Denver that same evening, having tracked Grant's flight and understood immediately that he had gone to Savannah and not to close the deal. She did not know that Vanessa was sitting in a Ritz-Carlton room 3 floors above where Grant had sat that morning, constructing a plan that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with what Vanessa was actually most afraid of, being irrelevant. Vanessa had built her entire professional identity on being the woman in the room that men turned toward. She was good at her work, genuinely good, but she had also learned, early and thoroughly, that her work was more effective when it was amplified by a certain kind of attention. She had moved through her career leveraging both, and it had served her well. Until right now, when the architecture of the situation had revealed a variable she had not accounted for. The woman she had assumed was Grant's orbiting satellite, keeping his domestic life running while he made his real life happen elsewhere. That woman was Savannah Whitmore. Vanessa sat in her hotel room and processed this information the way a chess player processes a board reversal, not with panic, but with rapid cold calculation. She was not stupid. She was not going to make the mistake of underestimating Savannah twice. But she also was not ready to walk off this particular board. She called Grant. He answered, which surprised her. She had expected to leave a voicemail. "How did it go?" she asked. "Warm, careful." "Don't," Grant said. "I just Vanessa." His voice was different than she had heard it in months. Quieter but not gentle quiet, settled quiet. The quiet of a man who has stopped performing. "I owe you an honest conversation and I'll have it with you. But not tonight. She's really not going to. This isn't about the deal." A pause. "I'll call you tomorrow." The call ended. Vanessa held her phone and looked at the ceiling and understood, with the particular intelligence she had always possessed but not always directed honestly, that something had shifted in Grant Holloway that her presence had not caused and could not reverse. She stayed in Denver anyway. She told herself it was professional. She had a right to be here. The Phoenix deal involved her consulting contract. These were legitimate reasons, and she stacked them like furniture against a door she could feel something pushing on from the other side. The next morning, Whitmore Meridian Holdings held a formal board meeting to review the Denver Community Initiative's expansion phase. The meeting was in the company's headquarters, a clean, modern building downtown that announced nothing about its tenants from the outside, which was very much a Whitmore stylistic preference. Senior executives, board members, 2 city representatives, and Caleb gathered in the main conference room at 9 a.m. Savannah took her place at the head of the table. She had worn a structured dark blazer and her hair was down, and she looked, Patricia would later tell a colleague, like someone who had always been meant to sit in that chair and had simply been elsewhere for a while. The meeting had been running for 40 minutes when the door opened. The assistant at the door said in a slightly strangled voice, "I'm so sorry." The visitor was quite insistent, and Vanessa Cole walked in. She was impeccably dressed, as she always was, in a way that was designed to be noticed without appearing to try. She looked around the room with the practiced poise of a woman who had walked into difficult rooms before, and always found a way to command them. Her eyes found Savannah at the head of the table. Something flickered across Vanessa's face there, and gone in under a second, that might have been genuine shock. Because whatever she had expected from Savannah's reclaimed life, it was not this. It was not a full boardroom with senior executives arranged attentively, and a city representative taking notes, and Caleb Mercer positioned at Savannah's right hand like the institutional memory of an empire. "Miss Cole," Savannah said. Her voice was perfectly even. "This is a closed board session. I apologize for the interruption," Vanessa said, not sounding apologetic. "I was hoping to have a word. This is not the moment for that. It's about the Phoenix deal." I know who you represent," Savannah said. "And I know your contract structure with Holloway Urban Development. Your role in the Phoenix deal is on our documentation." She held Vanessa's gaze steadily. "This is a closed board session. You're welcome to request a formal meeting through our offices. My assistant will schedule it." Vanessa looked around the room. The executives looked back, not hostile, simply waiting for Vanessa to make a decision about who she was going to be in this particular room. "This isn't over," Vanessa said, which was a mistake, because it was exactly the wrong register for the room. Too emotional, too personal, too much of a reveal. "Miss Cole," Caleb said, in the tone of a man who has managed large rooms for 30 years and is not remotely troubled by this one, "Security can assist you to the lobby." Vanessa left. The door closed. There was exactly 1 beat of silence in the boardroom. Then Patricia Osei, who had a very effective poker face, said, "Shall we continue with the expansion timeline?" And Savannah said, "Yes, where were we?" And the meeting continued. When the board members and city representatives had filed out, Patricia stayed behind. She closed the door and turned to Savannah with an expression that was professional but not quite. "Are you all right?" she asked. Savannah gathered her papers. She was all right. She was genuinely, somewhat surprisingly, "All right, I'm fine. That woman is Grant's problem," Savannah said. "Not mine." She looked at Patricia. She came in here expecting to find someone she could destabilize. Someone whose position was fragile enough that a dramatic entrance would tip something. She closed the portfolio. She found a board meeting. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "For what it's worth, the way you handled that was boring." Savannah said, "Which is exactly the right way to handle it. Boring is not a weapon that works well against drama." Patricia laughed a real laugh, surprised out of her. And Savannah, for the first time since she had walked off a plane in Denver 10 days ago, laughed too, open from somewhere that still worked. 2 floors below, Vanessa Cole stood in the lobby of Whitmore Meridian Holdings and made a series of rapid calculations. She understood now what she was dealing with. She understood what Savannah was and what she wasn't. And she understood that the move she had made upstairs had been precisely wrong, had revealed more about her than it revealed about anything else. She was smart enough to know when a situation had moved past the point where she was the most powerful person in it. She called a car to the airport. She did not call Grant. Grant Holloway landed back in Dallas at 2:15 that afternoon, having taken an earlier flight than he'd booked. He had things to do. Not revenge, not recovery, just the slow and unglamorous work of becoming someone who deserved to sit at a table with people who were actually honest. He had a company to run. He had employees who depended on the Phoenix deal coming through. He had a board that was going to have questions. He had a mother who was going to want an explanation and receive a much shorter one than she expected. He had, somewhere in the next 30 days, to figure out what kind of man he was going to be, now that he couldn't lie to himself anymore about the kind of man he'd been. He drove from the airport to the Holloway Urban Development offices. He walked in. Miles met him at the elevator with the expression of a man who had been managing a small crisis by himself all morning. "Vanessa is," Miles began, "off the Phoenix project," Grant said. "Process her contract termination, standard term, full notice period, professional and clean." Miles blinked. "Yes, sir." And Miles, he stopped, turned, "The community impact assessment for Phoenix Horizon. Pull everything we have on it. I want to review it myself. Top to bottom tonight." He paused. "If we're going to earn this deal on merit, then let's actually earn it." He walked into his office and closed the door. And in Denver, Savannah sat in her father's house as the afternoon light moved across the kitchen floor, and she opened a new design file on her laptop, the first original architectural work she had done in 4 years, and she began. Not for a client, not for the company, just for herself. Just to remember that she had always known how to build things, long before anyone knew her name, long before the empire and the trust and the billion-dollar balance sheet. She drew a house, small, modest, with good bones and generous windows and a kitchen where the light came in right. A house that looked like the place where someone could come home to themselves. She drew it for a long time, and the Denver afternoon settled into evening around her, and the mountains outside the window turned the colors they turned at the end of the day, and Savannah Whitmore sat in her father's kitchen and built something that was entirely hers. And no one in the world needed to know about it. That was the point. The 60-day waiting period under Texas law felt, to Grant Holloway, like being made to stand in a room where the walls were slowly becoming mirrors. Everywhere he looked, he saw himself, not the version he had curated, the successful founder, the ambitious builder, the man his father had finally started respecting, but the other version, the one that had existed quietly beneath all of that, making small decisions every day that he had never bothered to examine, because examining them would have cost something he hadn't been willing to pay. He threw himself into work. That was what he knew how to do. The Phoenix deal was moving through the consortium's review process, and Grant had taken his own advice, had pulled the community impact assessment and gone through it line by line himself, found 3 areas where his team had taken shortcuts that looked fine on paper but would fail real people in real ways, and had ordered revisions that pushed the timeline back 2 weeks and cost him a significant internal argument with his CFO. He did it anyway. He was not entirely sure why. Some part of him understood, without being able to fully articulate it yet, that the Phoenix deal was no longer just about Holloway Urban Development's survival. It had become, in some private and not entirely rational way, a test he was running on himself. Could he do work that was genuinely good? Not just profitable, not just impressive, actually in the ways that Savannah had meant when she talked about the Whitmore neighborhood initiative work that took the people it affected seriously. Miles noticed the change before anyone else did. He mentioned it to no one, but he noticed Vanessa had been off the project for 2 weeks when she called Grant's direct line on a Tuesday morning. He answered because he had said he would have an honest conversation with her, and he was trying, painfully and imperfectly, to be a man who kept his word. "I need to understand something," Vanessa said, no preamble. She had always moved fast. All right. Was any of it real? With us, Grant leaned back in his chair. He had thought about this question in the abstract, rolling it around in the quiet of the house that still felt too large and too silent. He had come to an answer that didn't flatter him. "I think I wanted it to be," he said. "And I think I let myself believe that was the same thing." Silence on the line. "That's an honest answer," she said finally. "I didn't expect an honest answer. I'm working on that." Another silence. "Then she's remarkable, you know. I walked into that boardroom expecting." She stopped. "I know what you expected," Grant said. "I expected the same thing. For longer than you did, you threw away something extraordinary." "Yes," Grant said. "I did." The call ended shortly after. There was nothing hostile in the ending, just two people who had used each other for purposes that neither had been entirely honest about, arriving simultaneously at the same clear-eyed conclusion. Vanessa Cole was not a villain. She was a woman who had seen an opportunity in another woman's neglected marriage and had taken it because that was what she had learned to do in a professional world that had taught her that positioning was everything. She was not evil. She was just not good enough in that particular moment to choose differently. Grant didn't call her again. He didn't hear from her again either. He assumed she had moved on to the next thing, which was what Vanessa did best. He found he bore her no ill will, which surprised him until he realized that the anger he might have directed at her was already fully occupied elsewhere, pointed, with devastating accuracy, entirely at himself. 3 weeks into the waiting period, Grant's mother called. Eleanor Holloway was 71 years old and had the particular brand of her gentility that very wealthy Southern women of her generation cultivated, like a formal garden, beautiful from a distance, and with thorns you didn't see until you were already bleeding. She had never liked Savannah. She had never said so directly, because Eleanor didn't operate directly. She operated through implication, through the slight pause before a compliment, through the careful question that contained its own answer. She had implied over 4 years that Savannah was sweet, that Savannah was gentle, that Savannah was lucky. She had never once, in Grant's memory, said that Savannah was capable. Eleanor had heard about the divorce through the family attorney, who should not have told her, but had been handling Pabla business for 30 years, and understood that Eleanor Holloway was not a woman you withheld information from without consequence. "I don't understand why you're not fighting it," Eleanor said. Her voice had the quality of fine china, beautiful and cold when you touched it. "The financial implications alone." "There are no financial implications. Mother, the divorce terms are straightforward. She's not taking anything from me." A pause. "Well, that's something at least." Though given what she apparently, Eleanor stopped, recalibrating. "I have to say, Grant, that if she was this Whitmore person the entire time, the deception was really quite. She didn't deceive me." His voice came out harder than he intended. "She was honest about who she was. She was Savannah. She loved me. That was all real. I'm the one who wasn't paying attention." Silence. "I see," Eleanor said in the tone she used when she did not see and had no intention of seeing. "I need you to understand something." Grant pressed his hand flat on his desk, the same gesture he had made in the coffee shop in Denver, like he needed something solid to push against. "The things you said at those dinners. The jokes. The comments about her weight, about her being the things you let people say in front of her. That was not acceptable. It was never acceptable. And I let it happen because I was more interested in not disrupting the evening than in defending my wife." Another silence. Longer this time. "Grant, I'm not asking you to apologize to her. That ship has sailed. I'm telling you that I know what happened, and I know what I should have done, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." He exhaled. "I love you, Mother, but I failed her, and some part of that failure had to do with what our family taught me about who was worth protecting." The silence that followed was the longest Eleanor Holloway had been quiet in Grant's adult memory. Then she said very quietly, "Your father used to say she had something." Grant blinked. "What, your father?" he said at once, after a dinner. He said, "That woman has something, Grant. I'm not sure you see it." Eleanor's voice had shifted into a register he almost didn't recognize. Something softer. Something that cost her. I told him he was being sentimental. Grant closed his eyes. I'll talk to you next week, Mother, he said. He sat at his desk for a long time after the call ended. His father had been gone for 6 years. Robert Holloway had been a difficult man, demanding, withholding with praise, constitutionally unable to say I love you without coughing first, but he had also been, in his particular and limited way, honest. He had looked at Savannah and seen something. And Grant had been so busy performing capability for his father that he had never thought to ask what his father actually saw. The 60th day arrived on a Thursday. Renata Voss, attorney, sent the final papers to Grant's attorney the previous evening. Everything was in order. Clean, professional. The terms were exactly what Savannah had outlined from the beginning. She took nothing of Grant's. She wanted nothing of Grant's. The house could be sold and the proceeds split, or Grant could keep it and pay her half the assessed value. She expressed no preference, which her attorney conveyed in a tone that made Grant's attorney quietly uncomfortable. Grant kept the house. He wrote the check. It cleared before he even thought twice about it. The mediation was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon at a neutral office space in Dallas, not a courthouse, because it did not need to be a courthouse. Everything was already agreed. The mediation was a formality, a final signature in a room with a professional witness, and Grant had known that going in, and had shown up anyway 30 minutes early, and sat in the waiting area with his hands between his knees like a man waiting on a verdict he had already been told. Savannah arrived at exactly the scheduled time. She came alone. No attorney sitting beside her, though Renata Voss was somewhere in the building. She walked into the waiting area and saw Grant and stopped for exactly 1 second before continuing toward the conference room. She was wearing the blue sweater. The one he had told her looked beautiful. He recognized it immediately and felt something tear very quietly in the center of his chest. She either didn't notice or chose not to acknowledge it. He suspected the latter. The mediator was a calm woman named Dr. Frances Abbott, who had the professional warmth, who had sat in this room with hundreds of people at the end of hundreds of marriages, and had learned to hold the space without filling it unnecessarily. She reviewed the terms, confirmed both parties understood, confirmed no coercion, confirmed both these proceeding voluntarily. Savannah said yes in a clear, steady voice. Grant said yes. Dr. Abbott set the final document on the table. She slid it first to Savannah. Savannah picked up the pen. She looked at the document for a moment, not with hesitation, but with the particular attention she gave everything, making sure she was doing what she meant to do and that she meant to do it. She signed. Dr. Abbott slid the document to Grant. He looked at Savannah's signature. The handwriting he had seen on grocery lists and birthday cards, and the occasional architectural sketch she left on the kitchen desk. The handwriting of 4 years. Before I sign, he said, "Can I say something?" Dr. Abbott looked at Savannah. Savannah gave the smallest nod. "I'm not going to talk about Vanessa," Grant said, "or the airport, or any of the specific things, because listing the specific things is just another way of managing the distance between me and what I actually did." He stopped, steadied himself. "I loved being loved by you. I want you to know that I understand the difference now between loving being loved by you and actually loving you. I enjoyed knowing you were there. I confused that with partnership. I let your steadiness become something I took for granted instead of something I tried to deserve." He pressed his hand on the table. "And because of your size, because you were gentle, because you seemed to need me financially, I think unconsciously believed you wouldn't leave. That you couldn't, that I was safe." He looked directly at her. "That says everything about what I thought of you that I never let myself say out loud. And I'm sorry, not to manage this room, I'm sorry because it's true, and you deserved someone who knew better." The room was very quiet. Dr. Abbott was looking at her notepad, giving them privacy in the only way available to her. Savannah sat with what he had said. She didn't rush to respond. She had never been a woman who rushed to respond, which Grant had once interpreted as slowness and now understood as the opposite. "You thought I stayed because nobody else would want me," she said. Her voice was completely even. "I stayed because I wanted you. There is a difference, Grant, and you're right that you never understood it. But here is what I need you to hear." She leaned forward slightly. "I am not leaving because I stopped loving you. I'm leaving because I finally started loving myself enough to know what I deserve. And what I deserve is someone who looks at me, at all of me, exactly as I am and chooses, not tolerates me, not keeps me. Chooses me, out loud, on purpose, every day." She sat back. "You never did that. Not once in 4 years did you choose me when it cost you something." Grant's jaw worked. His eyes were bright. He was not a man who cried easily. He had not cried in front of another person since his father's funeral, and he did not cry now, but it was close, closer than it had been in years. "No," he said, "I didn't." Savannah picked up the pen and looked at him one final time. "I hope you become someone who does that for the next person. Genuinely. Not because you're afraid of losing them. Because they're worth it." Then she stood, shook Dr. Abbott's hand, gathered her bag, and walked out of the conference room. Grant sat alone for a moment. He picked up the pen. He signed his name. He set the pen down. He sat there while Dr. Abbott quietly gathered the documents and said something about copies being sent to the attorneys, and he nodded without registering the words. Then he stood up and walked out of the building into the Dallas afternoon and stood on the sidewalk and looked at nothing for a long time. He had known it was over. He had known since Denver. But there is knowing, and then there is the moment the knowing becomes a document with both signatures on it. And those two things are not the same. The first one is in your mind. The second one is in the world, permanent and real. Filed somewhere official where it will exist long after this specific afternoon has dissolved into the past. He called Miles. "I need to take the rest of the day," he said. "Of course," Miles said. Then carefully, "Are you okay, sir?" Grant thought about the question. He thought about what honest meant. Now that he was trying to practice it, "No," he said. "But I will be." He walked 3 blocks to a small park he had never been to before, sat on a bench, and stayed there for 2 hours. While Dallas did what Dallas does in the mid-afternoon, moved fast and purposeful, and with complete indifference to any individual person's interior weather. He thought about Savannah's sentence. "I stayed because I wanted you." He thought about the weight of it. 4 years of wanting him, clearly and consistently, and he had looked at that wanting and thought, safe, he had thought convenient. He had thought, somewhere beneath language, somewhere in the part of himself he had never examined. She's lucky, she was never lucky, he had been lucky. And he had spent 4 years failing to understand the difference. Somewhere around 4:30, something shifted in him. Not healed, nothing like that, but settled. Like a bone that has been set and now has to be allowed to do the slow work of knitting itself back together. You can't rush bone, you can only stop disturbing the fracture. He got up, he went back to the office, he sat at his desk and opened the Phoenix Community Impact Assessment and worked on it until 9 p.m., making it better than it needed to be. Because better than it needed to be was the only standard he had left that he could look at without flinching. Miles stayed late without being asked. At 8:30 he knocked on Grant's open office door. With 2 cups of coffee from the machine down the hall and set one on the desk without a word. Grant looked up, looked at the coffee, looked at Miles. "Thank you," he said, and meant it in a way that was slightly larger than coffee. Miles nodded and went back to his desk. 3 days after the divorce was final, Holloway Urban Development received formal notification that the Phoenix Consortium had approved the financing package. The deal moved to closing. 212 employees exhaled. Grant's CFO sent a congratulatory email the board chair called personally. Grant accepted all of it quietly. He was grateful genuinely, not performatively. Those 212 people mattered to him in a way they had always mattered to him, and he was glad. But the win felt different than he had expected it to feel. Flatter. More earned but less triumphant, which he was beginning to understand was what honest success felt like as opposed to the performed version. He did not send Savannah a message about the deal closing. She knew her team had processed it. She didn't need him to report back. What he did not know, what he would not find out until 3 weeks later, through an industry publication that ran a profile on the Whitmore Neighborhood Initiative, was that Savannah had about revenue from the Phoenix Deals Consortium returns and quietly seeded the Entrepreneurship Fund for Women Rebuilding Careers After Divorce, Financial Dependency, or Extended Caregiving Absences. She had not named it after herself. She had called it the Fresh Start Fund. The application criteria were specific. Women who had been out of the professional workforce for more than 2 years, who were rebuilding from a significant personal disruption, who had a viable plan and no access to traditional financing. The fund provided capital, mentorship, and 2 years of operational support. No equity taken, no repayment required for the first 5 years. When the industry publication ran the profile, they interviewed Patricia Ossie, who said Ms. Whitmore built this fund out of lived experience. She knows what it's like to stand at a starting line with no one in your corner and no one taking you seriously. The fund is her way of making sure other women don't have to stand there alone. Grant read the profile 3 times. He sat at his kitchen table. The house was still too quiet, still carried the particular silence of a person who was no longer in it, and he read it 3 times. He looked at the photograph accompanying the article. Savannah at the fund's first event, standing with a group of women who were variously tearful and laughing and energized in the specific way people look when someone has just told them they believe in them. She was not looking at the camera, she was looking at the women. That was the thing about the photograph that undid him, just slightly in the privacy of his kitchen. She was not looking at the camera. She had never in 4 years seemed particularly interested in being seen by the room. She had been interested in the people in the room. He had understood that as modesty, as self-effacement, as the particular quality of someone who didn't quite believe they deserved to be the center of anything. He understood now that it had been none of those things. It had been genuine interest, real curiosity about other people, about their experience, about what they were building and what they were afraid of and what they needed. She had been interested in him that way once, deeply, genuinely interested in who he was. He had talked about himself for 4 years and never once understood that her attention was a gift, not a given. Buzzed, a text from his sister, Dana, who lived in Houston and had always liked Savannah and had not said so strongly enough, a failure she had apparently decided to address in retrospect by sending Grant a link to the same industry profile with a single line of text. Grant typed back, "No, I didn't." Dana's response took 30 seconds. "She's going to be incredible." "She already is." He put his phone face down and looked at the ceiling. He was 37 years old. He had built something real imperfectly, with some corners cut and some people not looked at directly enough, but real. He had a company of 212 people who depended on him to make good decisions. He had a mother who had said quietly and unexpectedly that your father saw something in her, and he had not known what to do with that yet, but he was carrying it. He had a divorce that was final and fair and entirely his own consequence. He had a great deal of work to do. Not on Phoenix, not on the next deal or the quarterly projections, or the board presentations scheduled for next month. The other kind of work. The interior kind, where you sit alone with the actual shape of your character and decide what you're going to do about the parts you don't like. He had been avoiding that work his entire adult life. He had been very busy. There had always been another project, another milestone, another dinner where performance was required and examined and could substitute for the actual thing. He was not busy tonight. The house was quiet. Dallas was doing its indifferent evening outside. He opened his laptop. He sat at the kitchen table and he searched, slowly and with some embarrassment, for the name of a therapist. A real one. Not the executive coach he had seen twice in 2022, for what had been described as leadership optimization, and had consisted mainly of a man confirming Grant's existing beliefs in slightly more sophisticated language. An actual therapist, someone who would ask him questions he didn't already know the answer to. He found one, he sent an email, he closed the laptop, sat for a while longer. In Denver, Savannah was on the phone with a woman named Clarissa, who had applied to the Fresh Start Fund with a plan to open a vocational training center in a neighborhood that had exactly nothing for its residents and exactly too much potential to be ignored. Savannah had read the application herself. She read all of them herself, which Patricia had gently suggested was not scalable. And Savannah had said she'd worry about scaling when they had more success stories than she had time to read about. Clarissa was nervous on the phone. She had done the application perfectly, but was apparently not sure a billionaire taking her call. But was something that happened in real life. "You said in your application," Savannah said, "that you were a vocational instructor for 11 years before you left to care for your mother." "Yes, ma'am, so you know exactly how to do this." "Yes, I do, and you know this neighborhood. I grew up there." "Then here's what I need from you," Savannah said. "I need you to stop asking permission. You have the knowledge. You have the plan. The fund is going to give you the capital. What I need from you is to walk into that space and act like you belong there, because you do." A long pause on the line. "How do you do that?" Clarissa asked. "Not strategically, genuinely. How do you just walk in like that?" Savannah thought about an airport curb in the rain. She thought about a boardroom where people stood when she walked in. She thought about a coffee shop table where she had said goodbye to a marriage without her hands shaking. She thought about her father's kitchen at 5 in the morning, putting on a pot of coffee with nowhere else to be, deciding practice, she said, and the decision that your presence in the room is not up for debate. Once you make that decision, everything else gets easier. Another pause. "Okay," Clarissa said quietly. "Okay." Savannah sat for a moment. The Denver evening was settling in. She had a board dinner in an hour, and Caleb would be here in 45 minutes, and she needed to change her shoes. She also needed She realized to finish the architectural drawing she had started in her father's kitchen the night she'd come home. The small house with the good bones and the generous windows. She had left it 60% complete and kept meaning to return to it and kept getting pulled toward the next urgent thing. Tonight. She would finish it tonight after the dinner. Even if it was late, it was hers. It didn't serve any purpose. It was just a thing she was making because she wanted to make it, because she had spent 4 years not making things for herself, and she was done with that particular habit. She changed her shoes, she gathered her bag, she looked in the mirror for exactly as long as necessary and no longer, and she was fine with what she saw there, not because of the blue sweater she had worn to the mediation, and come home in and hadn't changed out of, and not because her hair was cooperating, but because the woman in the mirror had made a decision a month and a half ago in a rainstorm outside an airport and had not once, in 43 days, looked back and wondered if it was the wrong one. That was its own kind of beauty, not the kind anyone else could give her. The kind that comes from the inside of a decision and lives there permanently. Regardless of what the room thinks of it, Caleb knocked. She heard his car in the driveway. Savannah picked up her bag, turned off the kitchen light, and walked toward whatever was next. The divorce was final. The paperwork was filed. Grant Holloway was sitting alone in a Dallas house learning what it felt like to sit with himself honestly for the first time in his adult life, and Savannah Whitmore, not Brooks, not anymore, simply Whitmore, the name she had been born with and had temporarily set aside, and had now reclaimed with the quiet authority of someone up a tool they had always known how to use, was walking out her front door into Denver evening to have dinner with people who called her by her right name. She had not asked Grant for anything at that mediation table. Not his guilt, not his regret, not even his understanding. She had not needed any of those things to know her own value. She had simply said what was true, signed what needed to be signed, and walked out. That was the whole of it. That was what it looked like when a woman stopped waits to someone else understand what she was worth and simply lived it instead. The board dinner was good. The wine was good. Patricia told a story about a zoning commissioner that made everyone at the table laugh until they were undignified about it, and Savannah laughed too. All the way. The real laugh that came from somewhere deep, and nobody at that table had any idea that less than 8 hours ago she had signed her name to the end of 4 years, and that was exactly the way she wanted it. After dinner, alone in her father's kitchen, she opened the drawing and finished the house. It took an hour and a half. When she was done, she sat back and looked at it. Good bones, generous windows, a kitchen where the light came in right. A house where someone could come home to themselves. She saved it, she closed the laptop, she went to bed. She slept. 2 years is enough time for a life to become unrecognizable from the outside while remaining completely coherent from the inside. Savannah Whitmore understood this the way she understood load-bearing walls, not as theory but as lived structural fact. From the outside, everything had changed. From the inside, she had simply become more completely herself, which was not a change at all but an arrival. Whitmore Meridian Holdings had transformed under her direct leadership in ways that the industry press was still trying to find adequate language for. The company had always been powerful. Richard Whitmore had built something genuinely formidable, and Caleb and the trustees had maintained it faithfully through Savannah's years of deliberate absence. But maintaining a thing and leading a thing are different operations entirely. And what Savannah brought when she came home was not just decision-making authority. It was vision. It was the specific and unusual combination of an architect's instinct for structure, a woman's accumulated understanding of what it feels like to be dismissed in rooms that should have welcomed you, and a billionaire's capacity to actually do something about both. The Whitmore Neighborhood Initiative had, in 2 years, converted 19 abandoned commercial properties across 4 cities into functioning community infrastructure. Not luxury development. Not the kind of urban renewal that displaces the people it claims to serve. Affordable housing with actual waiting lists that were actually being cleared. Vocational centers with actual job placement rates that other cities' programs were calling Caleb to ask about. Small business incubator spaces where 37 businesses had opened, and 29 of them were still operating, which was a survival rate that made conventional business school statistics look embarrassed. The Fresh Start Fund had approved 41 applications in 18 months. 41 women who had been standing at starting lines with no one taking them seriously, who now had capital and mentorship and 2 years of operational support, and who called Patricia Osie's office sometimes just to say that something was working. Patricia had started keeping a file of those calls. She did not tell Savannah about the file because she knew Savannah would tell her to stop keeping it, and Patricia had decided this was one area where she was going to exercise independent judgment. Clarissa had opened her vocational training center 8 months ago. She had 43 students enrolled in the current cohort. She had a waiting list. She had hired 3 instructors. She had called Savannah on the day of the ribbon cutting not to report in, not to thank her, but because she wanted to share the moment with someone who had told her, at a critical juncture, to stop asking permission. Savannah had taken the call standing in a Whitmore Meridian conference room between 2 meetings, and she had listened to the sound of 43 people talking and laughing in the background of Clarissa's phone, and she had felt something she was still learning to let herself feel without immediately moving past it. Pride, clean, uncomplicated pride in something she had built, in someone she had believed in before that person fully believed in herself. She had stood in the conference room for an extra minute after the call ended, just holding that feeling before walking back to the meeting. She was still learning how to do that, how to stay inside a good moment long enough to actually inhabit it. 4 years of marriage to a man who treated her presence as ambient background had trained her to make herself small in good moments as well as bad ones, to not take up too much space even in her own experience. Unlearning that was slower work than she had expected. Dr. Anita Reeves, the therapist she had been seeing every other week since month 3 of her return to Denver, had said something about this that had stayed with Savannah. You learn to be grateful for being tolerated. So now when you're genuinely celebrated, some part of you waits for the correction. You're waiting for someone to say, actually, we overstated that. You can go back to being ordinary now. Savannah had sat with that for a full session. How do I stop waiting, she had asked. You practice receiving, Anita had said. You let the good thing land, you don't deflect it or minimize it or immediately look for the catch. You just let it be real, she was practicing. It was harder than restructuring a billion-dollar company. She was practicing anyway. The morning of the Denver Community Development grand opening arrived on a Friday in early October, and the city had cooperated with weather that felt like a personal gift, crisp and bright, the kind of fall morning that makes people feel like things are possible. The opening was the culmination of 18 months of work on what had become the flagship project of the Whitmore Neighborhood Initiative, a full city block in the 5 Points neighborhood that had been abandoned for 11 years and was now, as of this morning, a functioning community campus, housing above, vocational center below, small business incubator on the east end, a community kitchen in the middle that 3 local restaurants had partnered to run on a rotating basis. The guest list was long: city officials, community leaders, residents who had watched the block sit empty for a decade and had been told repeatedly that nobody wanted to invest in their neighborhood. Architects, engineers, finance, journalists, a woman from a national housing advocacy organization who had flown in from Washington specifically because she wanted to see it with her own eyes. And somewhere on that guest list, because the Phoenix Horizon District development had involved subcontractors who had worked the Denver project, and because the industry was not that large, and events like this one had open professional invitations, was the name Grant Holloway. Savannah had seen his name on the list 3 days before the event. She had looked at it for a moment. She had not removed it. Caleb, who reviewed everything, had not mentioned it. That was its own form of commentary. She arrived at the event at 9:15, which was earlier than most guests and later than her team, who had been on site since 7. She moved through the space with Patricia and the project architect, a woman named Sue Lynn Park, who had designed the interior transformation and was, Savannah had learned, over 18 months of close collaboration, quietly brilliant in a way that delighted her every time it surfaced. The community kitchen layout, Savannah said to Sue Lynn, stopping in the central space. You moved the service window. Sue Lynn looked slightly pleased with herself. I moved it 6 inches east. The original position put the server facing the light at the wrong angle in the afternoon. Now they face away from it. You thought about the people using it. That's the whole job, Sue Lynn said simply. Savannah looked at her for a moment and felt the particular warmth of being around someone who understood. Without needing it explained, that design is an act of care for people you haven't met yet. Yes, she said, it is. The guests began arriving at 10. Savannah moved through the opening with the ease of a woman who had learned, in 2 years of practice, that this was her room. Not by entitlement, not by performance. Simply by being the person who had built it and who meant what she said when she said it was for the people in it. She spoke to a retired couple from the neighborhood who had attended every public meeting during the development process and had opinions about the parking situation that she listened to completely and took notes on because they were right. She met 3 of the vocational center's first cohort of graduates, who were all employed, one of whom was already mentoring a student in the new cohort, and who shook her hand with the particular grip of people who have done something hard and know it. She talked for 20 minutes with the Washington housing advocate, who asked sharp questions and received sharp answers, and at the end said, "Can I call you next month? We're working on federal policy, and I think you have things to say that the people in those rooms need to hear." Savannah said to she was in the middle of a conversation with the city's deputy planning commissioner when she felt, rather than saw, a shift in her own awareness, the specific awareness of a familiar presence in a room. She had spent 4 years developing a finely calibrated sensitivity to Grant Holloway's proximity, the way you develop sensitivity to any persistent weather pattern. It had not entirely gone away, which she had accepted as one of the less convenient facts of having genuinely loved someone. She finished her sentence to the deputy commissioner. She excused herself. She turned around. Grant was standing about 30 feet away, near the entrance to the small business incubator space, holding a glass of water he appeared to have forgotten about. He was wearing a jacket she didn't recognize, which meant it was new, which meant something about time passing. He looked different than he had in the coffee shop in Denver 14 months ago. Not dramatically, he was still Grant, still the same face, same build, same way of standing with his weight slightly forward, like a man always preparing to move toward the next thing. But something in him had settled, quieted. The particular quality of a man who has stopped performing and is simply present in a room. He was looking at her. She walked toward him because walking away would have been its own kind of performance, and she was done with performances. He saw her coming and straightened slightly. He did not smile yet. He was waiting to understand what kind of moment this was going to be. "Grant," she said, "Savannah." He looked around the space, then back at her. "This is extraordinary, what you've built here. My team built it," she said. I pointed in a direction. "You always did that," he said. "I just never watched where you were pointing." She looked at him. There was something different in the way he said it, not the Grant who had sat across from her in a Denver coffee shop 14 months ago, where the honesty had still been slightly managed, still shaped by the specific project of getting her to understand that he was sorry. This was flatter, quieter. The statement of a man who had had a lot of time alone with the truth and had stopped trying to make it more comfortable. "How are you?" she asked, and meant it genuinely, which was something she had wondered if she would still be capable of. She was. "Better than I was," he said, "not all the way. But better." He paused. "I've been seeing a therapist." She raised her eyebrows slightly. Not in surprise, exactly. In recognition of the fact that this was not something the Grant she had been married to would have said out loud in a professional setting, or possibly anywhere. "I have too." Something moved across his face. "Yeah? 2 years of being extraordinary in public requires significant behind-the-scenes maintenance," she said. And she said it with the dry edge that had always been part of her, and that he had, she realized now, almost never witnessed, because she had kept it tucked away around him. Kept herself to the gentler register, given him the version of herself that was least likely to disturb anything. He almost smiled. "You were always funny," he said. "I don't think I ever told you that." "You didn't. There were a lot of things I didn't tell you." "Yes." He looked at his water glass like he just remembered it. He looked back at her. "Was any of it real, Savannah?" "Our marriage, I need to know, not for I'm not asking to reopen anything. I just need to know if I'm remembering it right." She had thought about this question before. Not because she expected him to ask it, but because she had asked it of herself in her father's kitchen at various hours, trying to locate the marriage accurately, not generously, not bitterly, but accurately. "Every bit of it was real," she said. "That's why losing it should mean something. Not as punishment. As information. What you lost, Grant, what we both lost, was real. You should know that. You should carry it." He absorbed that. She watched him absorb it, the way she had always watched him process difficult things slowly, through the body first, the shoulders and jaw doing the work before the mind caught up. "I do carry it," he said quietly. She believed him. That was the thing she had not entirely expected to feel, the belief. But she had always been able to tell when Grant was honest, because it happened rarely enough that it had a specific quality when it arrived, like a window opening in a closed room. "Good," she said. "Not unkindly, that's what it's for." A burst of laughter from across the room pulled both their attention briefly. 3 of the Fresh Start Fund recipients were taking a photograph together near the community kitchen window, arms around each other, laughing at something one of them had said. Real laughter, the kind that doesn't know it's being watched. Savannah looked at them and felt it again, that pride, landing fully, inhabiting her completely for a clear and undefended moment. She let it, she stayed inside it. Grant was watching her watch them. "You look happy," he said. She turned back to him. "I am." He held her gaze for a moment, then he said, very quietly, "I'm glad." And the thing was, she believed that too. Inconveniently. She believed that Grant Holloway was genuinely glad she was happy, in the way that people who have truly loved someone can sometimes arrive, after enough honest reckoning, at a place where the other person's flourishing doesn't feel like a reproach, but like evidence that the love was real. She had not expected to believe it. She was glad she did. It made the whole thing smaller and more human, which was what the whole thing needed to be. "I have to give a speech in 20 minutes, she said. "And before that I have to find Caleb, who is somewhere in this building pretending he's not watching this conversation." Grant made a sound that was almost a laugh. "He was never subtle about not liking me." "He was extraordinarily subtle," Savannah said. "That's what made it so effective." She shifted her bag on her shoulder, extended her hand. "Take care of yourself, Grant." He looked at her hand. He shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and then he let go, which was the right thing, and he did it without hesitation, which meant he had made peace with the right thing. "You too," he said. Savannah. She walked away. She did not look back. Not because she was performing not looking back, but because she genuinely did not need to. She knew what was behind her. She had made her peace with what was behind her. What was in front of her was a podium and a microphone, and 300 people who had gathered to see what happened when someone decided to take a neglected neighborhood seriously. She found Caleb near the side entrance, exactly where she had predicted. "Were you watching?" she asked. "I was reviewing the speaker schedule," he said, without missing a beat. "Of course you were." She straightened her jacket. "How do I look?" He looked at her the way he had looked at her when she walked off the plane in Denver 2 years ago, with that particular contained warmth of a man who has been waiting a long time for someone to come home. "You look like your father," he said, when he was at his best. That hit her somewhere deep. She let it, she didn't move past it. "Thank you, Caleb," she said. He nodded. He handed her the brief note card with her speaking points, which she had written herself and did not need but had learned to carry, because it gave other people comfort to see her hold something. She walked to the podium. The room quieted. 300 people turned toward her. City officials, community residents, journalists, but fund recipients, advocates. Sue Lynn Park near the back with her arms folded and a small proud smile. Patricia O.C. in the third row with her recorder running. Clarissa near the side wall with 43 students somewhere behind her who had gotten the afternoon off to attend. And somewhere in the back, near the entrance to the incubator space, a man named Grant Holloway who had flown in as a contractor and was staying as a witness, because this was the only role available to him now, and he had enough new honesty in him to know that it was the right one. Savannah set the note card on the podium. She looked out at the room. She did not begin with thanks. She did not begin with acknowledgments of dignitaries or a history of the project. She began the way she had always moved through rooms when she was fully herself, directly, and with complete attention to the people in front of her. 11 years ago, she said, this block was written off. Not by accident, by decision. Someone decided that the people who lived around it didn't represent enough return on investment to bother with. Someone decided that a neighborhood's value could be calculated without counting the people in it. She paused. I've spent 2 years disagreeing with that decision. Not because I'm particularly heroic, I want to be clear about that, but because I had the resources to disagree loudly, and I believe that is what resources are for. The room was very quiet. The good kind of quiet. The listening kind. Every person in this room who built something, or applied for something, or showed up to a meeting about something when it would have been easier, not to you, are the reason this works. Not the money. The money is just the mechanism. You are the reason. She looked across the room slowly, making it real, making it contact rather than performance. This building is yours. What happens inside it is yours. The only thing I ask in return is that when you're in a position to point at a neglected place, a neglected neighborhood, a neglected person, a neglected possibility, and you have the resources to disagree loudly, that you do. She stepped back from the podium. The applause was immediate and full and genuine, the kind that starts before people have consciously decided to clap, which is the only kind that actually counts. Savannah stood at the podium and received it. She let it land. She did not deflect or minimize or look for the catch. She stood there, exactly as she was still the same body she had always had, the same face, the same chestnut hair, the same warm hazel eyes that had watched a man drive away from an airport 2 years ago, and she let 300 people's recognition arrive and mean something. She had earned this, not because she was a Whitmore, not because she had billions, but because she had gotten up after the worst night of her adult life, made a phone call she hadn't made in 4 years, and decided not cautiously, not with one foot still in the old life, but completely and without reservation that she was going to live as though she mattered. She had practiced that decision every day for 2 years. This was what it looked like. Patricia caught her arm as she stepped away from the podium and said, "Without preamble, the Washington Advocate wants 30 minutes with you next week. The mayor's office called this morning. They want to discuss expanding the initiative to 2 additional neighborhoods. And I got a call from a foundation in Chicago that wants to replicate the Fresh Start Fund model nationally." Savannah looked at her. "Set them all up. I already did," Patricia said. "I just wanted you to know the shape of it, Patricia." Savannah stopped, looked at her properly. "Thank you, not for the logistics and for believing this was worth building before we had proof." Patricia, who was not given to sentiment in professional settings, said, "You made it easy to believe in." Then she cleared her throat and moved on, which was her version of being moved. In the back of the room, Grant Holloway set down his water glass on a nearby table. He had watched the speech. He had watched the room respond. He had watched Savannah step away from the podium and immediately get pulled into 3 conversations at once, moving through each one with complete presence, each person receiving her full attention as if they were the only one in the room. He had spent 4 years with this woman. He had sat across tables from her and talked about himself, and accepted her attention as ambient. He had stood beside her at industry events and not introduced her to people who should have known her name. He had let his family make her small in rooms where she had been, without anyone's knowledge, the largest thing in the space. He understood now what he had been looking at and had chosen not to see. Not out of cruelty. Out of the specific and ordinary cowardice of a man who was afraid that if he looked at his wife directly, really directly, with all of his attention, he would understand that she was not lucky to have him at all, and that understanding would require him to become someone better. He had not been ready to become someone better. He was trying now, slowly, imperfect, in a therapist's office every Tuesday, in the community impact revisions he had demanded on the Phoenix Project, in the way he had started asking Miles how he was doing and then waiting for the actual answer. He was trying. It was not enough to undo what he had done. He knew that some things don't get undone, they get carried, and you decide what kind of man you're going to be while you carry them. He picked up his jacket. He moved toward the exit. He passed Caleb Mercer near the door, and Caleb looked at him with the expression of a man who has arrived at something like neutral, which from Caleb was practically a warm embrace. "Mr. Holloway," Caleb said. "Caleb." Grant paused. He was not sure why he paused. Then he said, "She's going to do remarkable things." Caleb looked at him for a moment. "She always was," he said. "Some of us were paying attention." Grant received that. He nodded once. He walked out. Outside, the Denver October hit him cleanly. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at nothing for a moment. He thought about the airport. He thought about a suitcase on a wet curb and words he had said that he could not unsay and choices he had made that he could not unmake. He thought about the photograph on his nightstand that he had finally moved to his desk drawer 3 weeks ago, not because it hurt too much to see it, but because it was time. Because keeping it on the nightstand had been a way of holding on to something that no longer needed to be held. He had let it go. He was still letting it go. That was the work, the daily, incremental, unglamorous work of becoming someone who had learned something real. He called his therapist's office when he got to the car. He left a message asking to move their Tuesday session to Wednesday this week because he had a Phoenix site visit on Tuesday that he wanted to attend personally. Not because it would impress anyone, because he wanted to see the thing he was building and know that it was actually good. The car pulled into traffic. Denver moved around him. In the community campus behind him, Savannah Whitmore was in the middle of her 4th conversation since the speech. This one with 2 residents who wanted to know if the community kitchen would offer cooking classes for seniors, which it had not but absolutely should, and she was pulling out her phone to call Sue Lynn before she forgot, because this was exactly the kind of that to get lost in the gap between a conversation and a meeting. That was her life now, full and specific and genuinely hers. Not a waiting room. Not an anteroom to someone else's ambition. Not the place she was in between the place she was supposed to be. She had stopped waiting for permission. She had stopped asking someone else to recognize her worth. She had walked back into her own name like it was a house she had built, and was now ready to live in completely, loudly, without apology. 2 years ago, she had stood alone in the rain at an airport while a man drove towards Sunset. She had not chased him, she had not screamed. She had made one phone call and changed the entire direction of her life. Not because she was a billionaire. The money was never the point. The money was just the mechanism. The point was the decision, the clean, clear, permanent decision that she was worth choosing, and that if he wasn't going to choose her, she would choose herself instead. And she had every single day for 2 years she had chosen herself, with the same consistency and loyalty and attentiveness that she had once directed entirely at a man who mistook it for a given. She had given all of that to herself instead. And then she had turned it outward toward Clarissa, toward 41 women at starting lines, toward 19 neighborhoods that someone had decided weren't worth the investment. Grant Holloway spent 4 years believing Savannah Brooks was lucky to have him. It took him 7 days to discover she controlled $3.8 billion. It took him much longer to understand that her billions were never the most valuable thing he had lost. He had lost the woman who loved him before she needed anything from him. The woman who had stayed in a house and a marriage and a life that was too small for her, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had wanted him to be the man she had glimpsed in a parking lot outside a Tex-Mex restaurant, nervous and genuine, asking a question that mattered. He had not been that man. And Savannah Whitmore, standing in a community kitchen she had built in a neighborhood someone else had written off, talking to 2 residents about cooking classes for seniors, completely present, completely herself, completely home in her own life, was no longer waiting for him to become one. She had found something better than being chosen by the right person. She had learned to be the right person for herself. And that was a thing no airport, no divorce, no man's careless hands on a suitcase in the rain could ever take from her. It was hers, completely and permanently hers.